How do you help your loved one with a developmental disability develop good, solid relationships for the future? This is one of the most common questions that I get from parents and caregivers. So I want to give you my top 3 tips to build lasting friendships for your loved one who has autism or an intellectual or developmental disability. So tip number 1 is to focus in on neurotypical relationships. Because people who have an intellectual or developmental disability or autism are lacking this type of relationship. And if you're thinking about those good, solid relationships for the future, you're thinking about people who can help your loved one make decisions. You're thinking about people who are going to have your loved ones back. So that's why I'm recommending that you intentionally put your focus on helping your loved one to develop more neurotypical relationships. And when I see this doesn't mean that neurodivergent relationships are not important. It's just that these are the types of relationships, can play a valued role in your life, but you're not thinking about those types of relationships when you're thinking about helping your loved one in the future. What I encourage you to do here is to be intentional about neurotypical relationships, and all it takes is one person to start out with. It could be a sibling, a cousin, a family member, to support your loved one to be in relationship with that person a little bit more, right? To connect with them, whether it's texting or being part of a group chat or seeing that person going for walks, engaging in a similar interest together. It can be any of those things. So that's tip number 1, be intentional about supporting your loved one to be in more neurotypical relationships, and that'll help serve you in the future. But we got to be intentional about that over time, and it's not just a snap of the fingers thing. It takes time to develop those relationships. So start being intentional now. Okay, tip number 2 is to support your loved one to be in ordinary places, contributing by doing things that are ordinary interests that your loved one might have. Okay, so if you want your loved one to be in a relationship with more neurotypical people, your loved one needs to be in ordinary places, not in special places or places just where people who have neurodivergences are. Okay, so for example, if your loved one's interested in art, consider looking at the ordinary art class options instead of the special art class options, because that's where the expectations are going to be higher. That's where there's going to be the opportunity to enter into a relationship with neurotypical folks, again, being intentional about more relationships with neurotypical folks moving forward. And that's a much more rich learning environment for your loved one to build the social skills that they need to really be successful and to continue to grow. If these tips have been helpful for you so far, I invite you to grab my Life Planning 101 guide, which has more relationship tips and helps you think through how to build a full life plan for your loved one. So you can get the link down below in the notes. All right. Tip number 3, this is a very practical tip that you can start implementing right away. Well, actually, all of these are. But as you'll notice in these tips, you are involved with supporting your loved one to build these relationships. And tip number 3 is definitely that as well. So tip number 3 is to walk your neighborhood regularly. Okay? When we walk our neighborhood regularly, other people see us. We get to know other people in our neighborhood. We're so disconnected often from our neighbors now. And when you're walking around in the neighborhood, I invite you to compliment other people on things. So whether it's like, oh, you have such a great dog, or I love those shoes, or what a great hat, or I love your coat, right? Because people love being complimented. It opens, and flattered, it opens the door to conversation. Oh, what's your name? And where do you live? And just simple interactions. And over time, if you're consistent about going for that walk every single day and going for that walk with your loved one every single day, then there's an opportunity to introduce your loved one to those folks. And it's so great to have folks in your neighborhood knowing your loved one, because as your loved one, continues to grow and gets out in the community more, there's gonna be more eyes looking out for your loved one. So when we think about safety for your loved one and maybe potential vulnerabilities that your loved one has, what a great thing to have neighbors knowing who your loved one is, looking out for them, and your loved one to be entering into relationship with those neighbors. And guess what? Majority of the neighbors are going to be neurotypical, and that's being intentional about neurotypical relationships, as I mentioned earlier. So just again, in summary, the 3 tips that I would invite you to try on is to focus in on neurotypical relationships, help your loved one connect with at least one more neurotypical person on a more regular basis, to be help your loved one, tip number 2, to be in ordinary places, right? With ordinary people exploring their ordinary interests. And then tip number 3, to walk your community more often, get into conversation with people just by giving them kind compliments. And the great thing about these 3 tips is it provides an opportunity for your loved one to see you model relationships and social skills. And mirroring is a great way that we all learn. So relationships take intentional effort and consistency over time. So you got to be consistent with this over time. And again, if you found these tips helpful, I invite you to grab that Life Planning 101 guide, which is going to help you build more strategies around friendships for your loved one to live an awesome, ordinary life. You've got this. I'm Eric Goll. I invite you to continue to take small steps forward.